What's going on, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. If this is your first time tuning into the VO2 Max podcast, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy today's episode and continue to listen to future episodes. As the title of this episode would suggest, the discussion of this podcast is focused on injury and the relationship to different training and lifestyle characteristics. I'm not going to be talking about the evidence base surrounding this from a broader and larger context. I'm going to be focusing on one specific study that was recently published this year in 2021, actually. And it wasn't that this particular study was, groundbreaking or earth-shattering, but some of the findings and results that came out of the study I thought were particularly interesting, especially because they can be tied to some topics and concepts that we have a lot more evidence surrounding. So there's a lot of research that's focused on injury risk in athletes and how that injury risk relates to different training lifestyle characteristics. So things such as like training intensity, training volume, nutrition, supplementation, and other lifestyle characteristics such as maybe sleep, and how those might be related to injury risk in athletes. So this area is relatively well studied, I would say, from the lens or from the perspective that there's been lots of studies that have been done. But it's kind of all over the place, and it's a difficult topic to kind of wrap your head around, because some studies will say that certain things and certain characteristics elevate the risk of injury among certain athletes, and then another study might not find that. So there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of confusion. And so I wanted to have a discussion about this, and I've done some previous writings and podcast episodes where I talk about injury risk a little bit, but I haven't necessarily had an episode where I focus solely on it. And again, I'm not going to be covering all of the available literature that's out there, but I wanted to cover this one particular study because it was recently published. And like I said, some of the findings that came out of it, we can really tie into what research says about certain training and lifestyle characteristics, like sleep and nutrition, training volume, things like that. So injuries, unfortunately, are relatively common amongst athletes, but especially amongst endurance athletes, which is just the wear and tear and the pounding that the body goes through to do the required volume and intensity that's necessary to perform well, especially as athletes get more and more competitive. Usually they have to do more and more training and kind of up the intensity of certain workouts in order to get the fitness adaptations to be competitive at a higher level. And so there's a commonly held belief that obviously the more training you do, the higher your injury risk is. And some research will support that. Other research might not, depending on the population that they study. But usually when people think of injury risk amongst endurance athletes, most people have kind of a very binary view on it, in the sense that they think more volume, greater injury risk, less volume, less injury risk. And it's a little bit more complex than that. It's not quite so simplistic and black and white. Even though some research will suggest that more training equals a greater risk of injury. And to a certain extent, that is true. Obviously, the more you train, the greater your chance of injury. Not only overuse injury, but also acute injury. Now, most research literature that focuses on injury risk tends to focus more on the kind of overuse chronic injuries that develop over time, not so much acute injuries, because those are for the most part outside of athletes' control. So think, for example, a cyclist who is, say, descending a mountain in a race, and they just happen to hit a sandy patch of the pavement going around a corner, fall down, break their collarbone. That obviously didn't necessarily have anything to do with their training or nutrition or sleep habits. So most research tends to focus more on the kind of chronic overuse related injuries, because those are things that we have a lot more control over as athletes. In the way that we train, the way that we recover, the way that our nutrition is, our sleeping habits are, everything that goes on within training and around training, we tend to have a little bit more control over whether or not we experience an overuse injury or not. Or we can at least reduce our risk of it. There are some people out there who believe that overuse injuries are inevitable for every single endurance athlete at some point in their career. And whether or not that's true, I don't know. I don't really know if we have the data to support that or not. But there are many things that we can do to reduce injury risk. And a lot of what we know about injury risk comes from the research that we've built up over the past few decades. And so this study kind of contributes to that literature. And so I'm going to go through what the methods were a little bit and then touch on some of the principal findings and then tie some of those findings in with what we know about certain training and lifestyle characteristics and how they relate to injury risk. So like I said, this paper was published in 2021. It was a relatively small study, pretty straightforward one as well. Essentially, the authors were just recruiting local triathletes, amateur triathletes, in the Miami, Florida area in the United States. They ended up recruiting 34 recreational or amateur triathletes, sort of in kind of on the older end in terms of athlete lifespan per se. Average age was about 48 years old, and it was about 33% female, 66% male. And that's kind of representative of the triathlete population at large. Triathletes, especially amateur triathletes, tend to be older, so it's more popular amongst kind of the middle age group. 40s, 50s, and 60s is pretty popular, and then it tends to be more male dominated than it is female dominated, with usually most races being 2/3 male or more. So I thought that was kind of interesting that it kind of lined up with what you might generally expect if you were to just walk up to a local Ironman race or half Ironman race from a demographic perspective. Now, basically, these authors recruited these triathletes and then gave them a one-time questionnaire in which they were gathering information related to current injuries or area of pain, as well as different training and lifestyle characteristics. So it was a retrospective study from the standpoint that they got these participants enrolled at a single time point and then asked them to recall information from the past or currently. All right, so that is obviously a limitation in and of itself because we can't necessarily establish any causal relationship. So just keep that in mind as I go throughout these results and these findings. Nothing in here is causal. It's all correlation and relationship based. But we can gather some good information from this as well. But just keep that in mind. Nothing is cause and effect in terms of these results and findings, which can be easily misinterpreted when you're talking about retrospective studies and prospective studies that aren't designed to detect causality. They're just designed to detect relationships. So going through some of the findings, let's start with injuries first. So not all that uncommon. The authors found that about 80% of the athletes enrolled identified with at least one current injury or area of pain. That's pretty common, especially amongst endurance athletes, to see injury rates that are upwards of 75-80% of the population included in the study. It all depends on who you include. Now, this study was potentially biased in the sense that one of the ways that they recruited participants was from a local physical therapy clinic. So they were probably more likely to get people that were already injured in the moment because they were enrolling people through a physical therapy clinic. It wasn't the only way that they recruited people, but they did acknowledge that they got about half of their participants from or through a physical therapy clinic. So that is probably inflating that number a little bit compared to what the actual representative injury rate is amongst recreational triathletes. I don't believe it's 80% of all recreational triathletes are experiencing an injury at any one point in time. It's probably quite a bit lower than that, but it isn't too uncommon to see research studies with endurance athletes and injury rates as high as 75 or 80% of the sample included in the study. And then another rather unremarkable statistic was 72% of all the pain and injuries reported were in the lower extremity. So amongst endurance athletes, that tends to be the most common injury site, especially amongst runners, cyclists, and triathletes, just because they don't do the volume of swimming that would necessarily increase the risk of an upper body injury like some pure swimmers might. So vast majority was lower body related injuries. And then again, pretty typical with what you would see in other research literature. Hip, knee, and foot were the most common. And then some of the other less common injuries were in the back, the neck, and the shoulder. But those were relatively minor compared to the lower body injuries. All right, so those were some of the basic findings related to injury prevalence. So now let's move on to some of the different training characteristics and some other lifestyle characteristics that these authors found with these 34 participants. So as far as training volume and injury risk goes, athletes who trained more than 12 hours a week had an average of 3.3 injury sites currently, compared with athletes training less than 12 hours a week who had an average of 2.3 injury sites currently at the time of this survey being administered. So those who trained more tended to have more injuries than those who trained less. And that's not too uncommon either to find in the research literature. As training volume goes up, the risk of injury goes up, or the prevalence of injury goes up. Other training characteristics. So 56% of athletes reported engaging in strength training. I'm going to touch on strength training a little bit later because I think this finding was rather important. But just barely half of athletes were engaging in some form of strength training. Now, they didn't really go in depth or into too much detail on any training characteristic, really. They kind of just touched on a lot of superficial, surface level items. So we don't know how often they were doing it, what the strength training consisted of, how much, how long, how many sets, none of that stuff, just if they did it or not. And all we know is that 56% of athletes in the study did it, so about 18 people out of the 34. 15% reported engaging in some form of yoga or Pilates, which isn't, I wouldn't necessarily expect that to be higher, that with this being recreational. Triathletes usually swim, bike, run is all most amateur triathletes will do, and then some will sprinkle in some strength training here and there. But just with the amount of time that triathlon consumes, usually doing anything more than swim, bike, run, and strength training is too much for most busy amateur triathletes. So that wasn't all too surprising. Most athletes trained under the guidance of a coach, which I thought was good. About 2/3 of them had a coach. Average training volume per week across every athlete was about 11.8 hours a week, but there was a huge range. So this is another potential limitation is just the massive range in training volume amongst these athletes. It averaged anywhere from 4 to 35 hours a week, which is an insane range in terms of weekly volume. Like 4 hours is barely anything, and then 35 hours is like more than a lot of professional triathletes will do, especially professional triathletes training for like Ironman and half Ironman distance events. So a massive range. So keep that in mind as I discuss the rest of these findings. Athletes planning to race a half distance event or longer averaged about 12.5 hours a week of training, whereas those planning on racing short distance, so sprints and Olympics, averaged about 10.8 hours of training, so about an hour and a half less or 2 hours less of training per week for those that were focusing on short course racing, which isn't too uncommon. Usually those training for longer distances will train for longer hours each week. Nutrition and supplementation. So this I didn't really find too remarkable, especially because authors didn't necessarily tie nutrition and supplementation to injury prevalence very well, and they really didn't dive too deep into nutrition. They really just asked about basic vitamin and mineral usage, and then just asked about specific diets that athletes were following. So it wasn't really looking at nutrition per se. It was more like dietary protocol and supplementation. So I didn't really find these findings particularly useful because it's just too broad. But about 2/3 of athletes reported using some form of vitamin or supplement, which again isn't too uncommon. Most amateur athletes will use some type of supplement. Multivitamin, no surprise, was the most common, with about half the people in the study using multivitamin. And then various other more minor percentages of athletes in this study using different things, like just a vitamin-specific supplement, protein supplements, calcium supplements, fish oil supplements, iron supplementation, and those were most of the other supplements that athletes utilized. And then there were various percentages of athletes that followed like a gluten-free diet, lactose-free diet, vegetarian diet, vegan diet. I think the only interesting thing that really comes out of the nutrition and supplement piece of this study is that basically no matter what they took, what supplement the athletes took, or what dietary protocol they were following, everyone experienced at least one injury. There was really no one that followed a specific dietary pattern that tended to have a lower prevalence of injury than another group who was following a different dietary pattern. So in other words, it didn't really matter in this study if participants were vegetarian, vegan, lactose-free, gluten-free. They all those groups had people that experienced injuries. And then the authors didn't necessarily do much with supplementation and tying certain supplement use to injury risk, so nothing we can really report on further with the nutrition. And then the last thing that I found relatively interesting, or actually really interesting, because I'm going to touch on this a little bit later as well when I talk about strength training, but the vast majority of people in this study were not sleeping very well, or at least enough, because we don't really know about the quality, but the authors did ask participants about the quantity of sleep that they got. Among the 34 athletes that were in the study, only 16 of them completed the survey questions regarding sleep, which was kind of unfortunate. I wish that everyone had completed those questions. But even just amongst those 16, only 63% of athletes reported sleeping 63% of those athletes reported sleeping 6 hours or less. So that's over half of just the small amount of people that actually filled in those sleep-related questions slept 6 hours or less, which is abysmal. Like, less than 6 hours is such a poor quantity of sleep to get, especially for an athlete. And I'm going to talk more about sleep in a minute or two, because sleep and strength training, I think, were two of the more important findings from this. And nobody reported sleeping more than 9 hours per night. Now, you don't necessarily need to sleep 9 hours or more per night, but like I said, I'm going to talk about sleep a little bit more in the coming minutes, but and its relationship with injury risk. But sleeping less than 6 hours a night is way less than optimal, especially for an athlete, whether you're recreational or professional. Less than 6 hours a night is definitely going to have an impact on your ability to recover and potentially on your injury risk, as I'm going to discuss further here in a few minutes. So those were all of the kind of general findings that came from this study. And like I said, there were a couple that I found particularly interesting that I think we can touch on, because we can tie it into the evidence we have surrounding these characteristics and their relationship to injury risk. So first off, let's talk about the volume component. So those who trained more than 12 hours a week had more injury sites than those who trained less than 12 hours a week. So there's a greater prevalence of injury amongst those who trained more than 12 hours a week. And so one would look at this and they might think, okay, those who train more are going to get injured more. And even though that's what the data here would suggest, keep in mind it is just association or a relationship based finding. So it isn't causal. So this isn't saying that if you go past 12 hours a week of training, you're going to get injured more. But it was interesting that those who trained more tended to have more sites of injury at the time of this study. Now, like I said, this isn't super, super uncommon, especially amongst triathletes and runners, where they're both doing some form of running each week, and running tends to carry with it the highest rate of overuse or chronic injury, just because of the pounding that running puts on the body compared to something like swimming or cycling, where it's a little bit more gentle on the skeletal muscular system. Now, I don't know if there's enough data to necessarily suggest that just volume in and of itself causes an injury. So what I mean by that is, it's not like there's some magic number at which if you cross it, you're gonna get injured. I think what's interesting when we have a discussion around volume, endurance training volume and injury risk, is that volume is basically one way of categorizing or characterizing stress that an athlete is under, right? So there's volume, there's intensity, there's frequency, there's all these factors, and volume is one that dictates how much stress the athlete is under. So the more training that an athlete does, the more stress that the body experiences. And it's the stress that potentially increases the risk of experiencing an injury. But really, it's just the stress that you don't recover well from that increases the risk of an injury. So obviously for, like, say, professional runners who are running an insane amount of mileage or miles each week, there is probably some threshold at the upper end of what's humanly possible that once you go beyond it, your risk of injury from just the activity itself causes your risk of injury to go up. But I think especially for most amateur athletes who don't do an insane amount of training, it's usually just the stress that those athletes don't recover from, at least in my personal experience, that I've seen is more so related to injury risk. So I think there are definitely athletes out there. You could have two athletes who have the same life, the same work, the same family, let's say they have the same number of kids, the same job commitments, family commitments, all that stuff. And they could both be training 15 hours a week. But if one of them doesn't recover very well from that training with poor sleep, poor nutrition, poor training habits, poor periodization, and the other one trains 15 hours a week, but they do really well with sleep, nutrition, periodization, all the things that we know go into good training and good recovery habits, the person with the poor habits is probably more likely to get injured, not because of the volume itself, but because they're not recovering from the stress that volume is placing on their body. And so it's a little bit more cloudy than just saying, well, the volume is what increases the risk of injury. It's more so what's going on around that volume and the things that athlete is doing to recover from that volume that I think is more important. And so I wanted to make sure I touched on that point, because it's pretty common to see that more training volume increases the risk of injury, but I think there's more to it. And that's where I think in this particular study, strength training and sleep were two of the most surprising things that I got out of this study. So like I mentioned earlier, just barely half of the triathletes in this study were engaging in strength training. And we don't know like the quality of the strength training they're doing, how often, what they're focusing on, but strength training has been very well documented to reduce the risk of overuse-related injury amongst athletes, especially endurance athletes. And so regular strength training is one way, and especially if it's the specifically targeted strength training for endurance athletes, you can reduce your risk of injury via that strength training. And so it could just be that maybe this group experienced a really high rate or prevalence of injury because such a small proportion of them were engaging in strength training, barely half of them. And so that might have contributed to some of the injuries experienced among some of these participants, because we do know, like I said, that strength training can reduce the risk of overuse-related injury. So that was the first really surprising thing that came out of this for me, was the relative lack of participation in strength training. And strength training has kind of taken a while to, at least for endurance athletes, to be a priority. There used to be a time where endurance athletes would just do endurance activity and not do strength training for a variety of reasons, but most of them misconceptions about gaining muscle mass and that worsening their performance and different things like that. But it's starting to become more accepted amongst coaches for sure, but a little bit slower with athletes to realize the importance of strength training, not just for reducing the risk of injury, which it can do, but for augmenting or for enhancing performance. And so I was really surprised to see that just barely half of the athletes in the study did some form of strength training. And we don't even know if it was like good quality strength training with the frequency that you would want to reduce the risk of injury and improve performance. So that was one big factor at play. The other one was sleep. So like I said, even though there was only 16 athletes that responded to the questions related to their sleep, almost 2/3 of them got less than 6 hours a night of sleep, which I find is crazy. But it isn't surprising to me because it's relatively common. I mean, the majority of amateur athletes that I've worked with are all really busy, right? Like most triathletes who aren't professionals have full-time jobs, families, potentially. They're going to school and working part-time maybe at the same time. I mean, they all have lives, obviously, and just life in general is busy, regardless of if you have a family or not, or if you have a full-time job or not. People are just busy in general. But I tend to find that usually most triathletes are very type A kind of personalities, and they tend to be overachievers who like to do a lot, like to stay busy. So usually they are the type of people who have, a full-time job and career, and they have a family and kids, and, they have a social life they're trying to keep up with. And then on top of it, they're throwing in an extremely demanding sport. And usually one of the first things to go is sleep, where they'll, cut an hour or two here and there. And before you know it, they're not getting enough sleep, and then they're chronically sleep deprived. So the majority were getting less than 6 hours a night of sleep, and nobody was getting at least 9 hours or more. Okay, so most people were less than 6, and then the rest, about a third of them, were between 6 and 9 hours. Now, there's pretty good research to demonstrate that 7 hours per night of sleep or less is associated with a 1.7 times greater risk of musculoskeletal injury amongst athletes. And that was coming from a recent, I think, meta-analysis. So it was kind of a synthesis and compilation of a bunch of studies that have been done related to sleep and injury risk, which is huge. So think about it. The majority of people are probably not getting 7 hours per night of sleep, but that almost doubles the risk of injury. It's a 1.7 times greater risk of injury to sleep 7 hours of night or less as an athlete. And if you go around and you just ask most athletes that I guarantee you the vast majority of them are not sleeping 7 hours of night, especially if they're someone with a career and a family. If all they do is, maybe work from home and they have nothing else going on, and then they just do triathlon, maybe they're getting enough. But in my experience, most of the athletes I've worked with, it's a real struggle to get them to sleep a little bit more and get closer to that 7 to 8 hour range. And usually that's what's recommended. So for the average person who isn't an athlete, 7 to 8 to 9 hours, so somewhere in that 7 to 9 hour range is recommended. And for athletes, it's obviously a little bit higher. It can be 8 to 10 hours, with it maybe being closer to that 9 to 10 hour range under intense training and really heavy training loads. And it's why you'll see professional triathletes who just get insane amounts of sleep. They'll sleep 9-10 hours a night, the vast majority of them. And they're not getting up at, 3-4 a.m. to go train. They're going to bed at 10 o'clock, waking up at 7, and then fitting their training in the late morning and afternoon. Whereas with most recreational and amateur triathletes, they're kind of burning the candle on both ends, getting up really early to train before family commitments, work commitments, and then after they take care of family and then work and then family again after work, they might be squeezing in more training and then going to bed even later. And so I think with this particular study, the fact that so few people in this study were getting sufficient sleep could have drastically increased the risk of injury that these athletes were experiencing. And it could be potentially why the prevalence of injury in this study with this athlete population was so high, being almost 80%. But I thought that the two findings surrounding strength training and sleep were interesting, and they lead to me having a discussion surrounding the importance of strength training and sleep and the literature that we have surrounding these two topics, and how they relate to risk of injury. So I think if you're listening to this, and whether you're a coach or an athlete, I think one of the really important things that you can take away from this particular study, or two of the most important things you can take away, is the critical role that strength training plays in an endurance athlete's training program. So not only from an injury risk perspective, but it also does have some benefit for performance in general. So strength training, but if you're an athlete or you're coaching an athlete who doesn't do any strength training, the first step would be to get them to be doing some type of basic strength training program, because it will start to reduce their risk of experiencing overuse-related injuries. And then the second most important thing to take away from this is prioritizing sleep. And for the vast majority of people, 5, 6, 7 hours a night just isn't going to do it. You can only get away with that for so long before the body breaks down and it can't recover. And so prioritizing sleep, even if it means missing some training sessions, is probably more important, honestly, than the training sessions themselves, because you're going to be recovering better from the training that you are doing. So strength training and sleep, I think, were the two most important things that I took away from this particular study, just because the amount of people who weren't doing strength training and the amount of people who weren't sleeping enough was so alarming to me. So hopefully you found this interesting and you found some of those results from this study rather interesting. As always, I'll be sure to link in the references into the show notes so that you can go and look at some of these papers and references yourself if you would like to learn a little bit more. And I would specifically recommend that you check out the systematic review and meta-analysis published by Lauersen et al. From 2014. In that review and meta-analysis, they discuss the effectiveness of various exercise interventions and their ability to prevent sports-related injuries. That's a really good one. And then also the reference by Wang et al. From 2021. So this one's a little bit more recent, but this one talks all about sleep and the risk of injury. It was a great write-up and review discussing the role of sleep and how it relates to risk of injury. So again, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast and took a little bit away as it relates to various training and lifestyle characteristics and how they can relate to the risk of injury amongst amateur triathletes. As always, I hope you continue to listen to future episodes and looking forward to having you in the future. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. The support is greatly appreciated. If you want to support the show a little bit more, I have set up a Patreon link, and I've included that Patreon link in the show notes. So if you feel like giving us a little bit of extra support, feel free to do so through Patreon. Also, feel free to give us a review or a star rating, depending on which platform you are listening on. Those reviews and the feedback is greatly appreciated. And then finally, if you know of someone who would be interested in our podcast show, feel free to share this episode or just the podcast in general with them, and that is greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for tuning in to today's episode, and thank you for supporting the show.